What you need to know about coronavirus on Thursday, May 7. A version of this story appeared in the May 7 edition of CNN's Coronavirus, Fact vs. Fiction newsletter. Sign up here to receive the need-to-know headlines every weekday. The prospect of a prolonged economic slump is coming into sharp focus as global forecasts project an economic collapse at a scale not seen since the Great Depression. The staggering extent of the economic pain the United States now faces will be crystallized in two new rounds of unemployment data due to be released today and Friday. Every day brings signs that what first looked like temporary job cuts could turn into permanent layoffs. Families are already feeling the effects. Among mothers with young children, almost 1/5 say they're going hungry, according to a survey by the Brookings Institution, a rate far worse than in 2008, during the global financial crisis. President Donald Trump has made clear that the economic cost of the national lockdown has grown too steep, despite projections that many more will die as the U.S. reopens. "We have to be warriors," Trump said yesterday. "We can't keep our country closed down for years." And while he reversed a decision to phase out the coronavirus task force, it will now be pivoted to focus on reopening the nation. The bleak financial picture looks much the same across the pond. As Europe begins to open back up, Brussels warns the Eurozone faces an existential threat if the economies of member states do not recover evenly. The UK is headed for the worst crash in more than 300 years, according to the Bank of England, which said the country's economy could contract by 14% this year. The calculations are a bleak reminder that the fallout from the crisis could cripple the world's economy for months and likely years to come. Coronavirus Town Hall in tonight's Coronavirus, Facts and Fears Global Town Hall, former Vice President Al Gore and director Spike Lee will join Anderson Cooper and Sanjay Gupta at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You asked. We answered Q. Is it safe to go to the hospital during the pandemic? A. Earlier this month, Dia Suwa Singh faced a dilemma. The 41-year-old living in Toronto has a history of kidney stones and was feeling telltale symptoms. But faced with the complications of a routine medical appointment, she asked herself, was it worth it to go in? Many of us will face our own version of that debacle in the coming months. The first step is to call your doctor. This is what you need to know if you're going to the hospital during the pandemic. Send your questions here. Are you a healthcare worker fighting COVID-19? Message us on WhatsApp about the challenges you're facing, +1 347 322 0415. What's important today? U.S. stockpile no match for pandemic as complaints about dire shortages of protective gear for medical workers on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis began to stream in. President Donald Trump was quick to point the finger of blame at his predecessor, Barack Obama. To an extent, the president was right. The Obama administration used and then failed to replace items from the nation's strategic national stockpile to fight the 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic. But Trump hadn't replaced those items either, despite repeated warnings that the country was ill-prepared for a pandemic, stockpile experts said. The British government is facing similar criticisms that vital items of personal protective equipment, PPE, were missing from the UK's national stockpile. To shore up supplies, the government ordered around 400,000 surgical gowns from a Turkish company in mid-April. But the gowns were never distributed among health workers because they did not meet safety standards. First ICE detainee dies from coronavirus. A 57-year-old man from El Salvador became the first person to die from coronavirus while in Immigration and Customs Enforcement custody, a senior U.S. immigration official told CNN. Reports of the man's death drew swift condemnation from immigrant rights organizations who have been pushing for weeks for ICE to release more detainees from its facilities and warning that the Trump administration is using the pandemic to push its aggressive immigration agenda. The U.S. has continued to deport thousands of people during the outbreak, including some who are sick. Sports return to U.S. On Saturday, the UFC is scheduled to become the first sport in the U.S. to return to action, with the organization's president acutely aware of the increased scrutiny that's inevitably coming his way. All eyes are on Dana White and his Ultimate Fighting Championship, with 3 fight nights planned in the space of 8 days in May. And the stakes simply could not be higher. Listen, we have families too, White told CNN Sport. I don't want to die. Germany's success story behind Germany's success in bringing the virus to heel is Angela Merkel. The German chancellor, who has a PhD in quantum chemistry, has made a remarkable turnaround since the start of the year, when she was relegated to the sidelines as a lame duck leader. Now she is a beacon of global leadership, Ivana Kotasova writes. Yesterday, the Chancellor unveiled plans for the partial lifting of Germany's lockdown, allowing shops to reopen and people to meet in small groups. The first phase of the pandemic is behind us, but we are still at the beginning, and it will be with us for a long time, Merkel said. 57,000 people are still stuck on cruise ships. Most cruise passengers have made their way back home, and the vast ships that once ferried them from port to port are moored up or back on the water, relocating for the next stage in their journeys. But what about the crews that kept these gigantic vessels going and looked after guests as panic over the coronavirus swept across the oceans? Brazil sees record daily deaths. Brazil, the hardest hit country in Latin America, registered a record number of cases and deaths yesterday, forcing the health minister to raise the possibility of strict lockdowns in hotspots. The spokesman for President Jair Bolsonaro has become the latest government official to test positive for the disease. On our radar. During the Great Potato Famine, the Choctaw Nation sent $170 to starving Irish families. Now hundreds of Irish people are repaying that old favor, donating about $500,000 to two Native American tribes suffering during the pandemic. The U.S. Supreme Court was holding arguments over the phone because of COVID-19 yesterday, when all of a sudden there was the distinct sound of a toilet flushing. Two customers shot two McDonald's employees in Oklahoma after they were asked to leave the dining area due to lockdown-related restrictions. Street artist Banksy unveiled a new artwork to honor UK healthcare workers. He donated the painting, which depicts a small child playing with a nurse doll, to the University Hospital Southampton, US, in the UK, where it is hanging near the emergency department. Greece says it'll reopen to tourists on July 1, but the summer season will likely look a lot different. Meanwhile, in Ibiza, COVID-19 has crashed that party. At least 8 people in India have been killed by a toxic gas leak at a chemical plant which was reopening after the easing of coronavirus lockdown measures. This is supposed to be a busy time for Bollywood. But the coronavirus has ground India's prolific film industry to a halt, likely costing it more than $330 million in lost box office revenue and cancelled production shoots. Top tips: bored of lockdown yet? That could be a good thing. Psychologists say that boredom has had a lot of bad press, and the pandemic could actually unleash a creative renaissance on a global scale, or at least, make us more comfortable with our inner selves. If we do it right, that is. Check out these tips for making the most out of your newfound free time. Today's podcast: I had a moment at home by myself, born out of complete irrationality, where I suddenly was convinced that I was going to die of this. Dr. Stephen McDonald, a New York City ER doctor. Healthcare workers on the front lines are risking not only their lives, but their mental and emotional well-being as well. CNN's chief medical correspondent Drive. Sanjay Gupta speaks with Dr. McDonald about the psychological toll of his everyday reality. Listen now. Click subscribe to receive the latest news.